I understand it's a really polemic issue. I want to go out and say that I do not agree, obviously, with the sentiments of the radical right, so I have a personal bias in that, and I don't intend to lambaste any individual political figures, but obviously that's going to be part of the discussion. And I would like to take this opportunity to highlight what I think is a perennial issue in criticizing the radical right that we encounter more and more today, and that we need to be precise in critiquing the ideology of radical groups and in using our terms with precision and clarity in order to make accurate critiques that affect better political discourse. So with that, the theme of tonight is echoes of 20th century fascism in modern politics and culture. Approaching that, I have two guiding questions. Firstly, to what extent do radical right movements around the globe reflect the ideology of 20th century fascism? And secondly, are we correct in using the term fascist to describe policymakers, individuals, and groups who reflect values of that ideology in the present day? In short, are we looking for the word fascism when we describe those groups, and is that the right word to use? And the answer I have for that is, it's not wrong, but it is to some extent imprecise to call every radical right group fascist, and there's a bit of danger in that imprecision. So as much as it's satisfying or even humorous to use fascism in the pejorative in legitimate political discourse, we need clarity, out of a fear of overusing or misusing that word. Fascism takes aspects that are unusual but not unheard of in a lot of liberal democracies and amplifies them to a perverse extreme. That's what invites bigotry and hatred and fear and detrimental policies. And that means that there are certain values shared among fascists and the radical right in liberal democracies like the US, like many that we see around the globe. But fascism is itself a distinct ideology that invites a certain political and economic structure. And so making that comparison, it means that all fascists are members of the right authoritarian group, but not all radical right populists necessarily qualify as fascists. So using that term may not actually get at what is so troubling about their policies or about their beliefs. Simply put, we shouldn't resort to name calling in making political criticism when there's more precise terminology to use. So through a historical and international understanding of fascism, which I think is what we're getting at tonight, and what it reflects in the modern day, I think we can be better equipped to make those precise critiques. So to begin, what is fascism? We already discussed it's a mainly European phenomenon, and if you want to know what fascism is, all you have to do is ask a fascist, because they will tell you. It's what they love to talk about, what they love to write about for a lot of the 20th century, and it's especially evident in the kind of figureheads of European fascist movements that were successful in seizing some extent of power. Something that we go back to a lot as a primary source is Benito Mussolini's What is Fascism? An encyclopedia article from 1932 that he had inserted in the Italian encyclopedia to make it clear to everyone that he was ruling over exactly what they stood for. And it's a summation, to some extent pedantic, of the major themes and ideas undergirding the political ideology. And kind of flesh out our definition of fascism, I think I'll give a general idea here. It's a political ideology that conceptualizes the state above all else. It relies upon hyper-nationalist sentiment, suppresses individuality, and mobilizes all relevant societal functions towards a militaristic intent, usually in the case of European fascist militaristic expansion, especially we remember the case of Nazism with regards to that. Obviously, it's a very radical idea, but it has somewhat concrete definition and goals in a lot of the literature. So these are kind of four major themes I wanted to harp on as our connecting ties to the modern day. So if you look into fascist ideology, these are kind of four facets that will reflect themselves later, and we'll talk about that as echoes in the modern day. The first kind of speaks for itself, so I won't go into that very much. With the idea of militarism and expansion, militarism is just the emphasis. Mussolini says this a lot. It's kind of key in Nazi ideology as well, that peace isn't the natural state of things. In liberal democracies, we kind of value that peace as like what you go back to. You go to war, you come back to peace. They kind of flip that on its head. It's natural to be struggling. It's natural to be going towards military ends. And that in the modern day, expansion obviously meant imperialist expansion at the time, but it can also mean more things in a more neo-colonial sense in terms of having your military and using it to expand pressure onto other regions without necessarily changing the borders. Absolute state power, by that I mean the centralization of authority in an exceedingly small command structure that kind of revolves around a single personality or a single group that's very small. And obviously in European fascism you have dictators, although that term itself is kind of difficult to describe. It doesn't necessarily describe the command structure so much as the personality, but the idea being that you bring all the power into a very small group of people who are making the decisions, taking it away from the masses, anti-democratic essentially. And then the rejection of diversity means the complete suppression of opposition thought, and in some cases, especially in Nazism, the exclusion and elimination of individuals that don't conform to a constructed norm. So that's constructed, especially not only because it's constructed on the grounds of specious concepts of race, but also on the grounds of fascist myth-making, which we kind of touched on earlier, that there's this past pure ideal that we're trying to return to. And so that is inherently a unifying force for those who fit within that norm and a suppressing force and exclusionary force for those who don't, for those who look and think differently. Its classic appeal is to those disenfranchised, often young people who can find a sense of identity and accomplishment by joining this kind of cult of unity, is what a couple authors have called it, that eschews their individual faults and allows them to join this kind of idea of a better future that draws on the purity of the past. It can be attractive to people who don't, who haven't achieved much individually. So if you think about losing your individual thought, individual faults and joining into this kind of pure ideal, you can see how that would be appealing to certain populations. Also, as we noted before, it's historically not limited to Germany, Italy, and Spain, nor is it limited to Europe, though none of the external fascist movements were especially successful, nor were the attempts of European fascists to spread their ideas that successful. I mean, Mussolini visited North Africa a number of times, kind of tried to create alliances there that didn't amount to much. So we can discuss that more if there's interest in that. So, talking about echoes in the modern day, they're kind of taking those themes and putting them in a modern context. There are certain actors in politics around the world that reflect those themes but are not themselves fascist necessarily. Neo-Nazi groups around the globe, of course, get closest because it's in the name. Obviously, the more hardline groups may emulate the philosophy, but they really buy more into the racial unity aspects. It's more of a hate group than anything else, not really a mode of government. There are legitimate political parties in the sense that they are in the government at this time. That's been troublingly frequent in Germany. This isn't to suggest that those parties are fascist, but again, they reflect some of the nativist kind of themes and other issues that we discussed in the previous slide.
You mean in Parliament, not?
Yeah, in the Parliament. Yeah. In parliamentary elections, and not necessarily holding seats in all European governments. Specifically, some parties I have in mind are Alternative for Deutschland, now is the third largest party in parliament. Obviously, that doesn't give them direct executive power or even legislative power necessarily, but it's worth noting that they have won a significant amount of the votes in that country. Some other European parties include the Czech ANO Party, the Party for Freedom in Netherlands, and the ever problematic Front National. Then looking at state authority, I mean individuals who have relatively influential positions in government, even if that doesn't mean executive power. Duterte is kind of an exceptional case of someone who reflects a lot of the themes, mostly through his militant nationalism. He, of course, was quoted last year, I believe, praising Hitler for his genocidal activity, saying that he'd like to emulate it in exterminating potential criminals and drug users. He's current president of the Philippines, if that's unclear. He's known for promoting extrajudicial killings writ large, has even claimed himself, not only been accused, but bragged about killing men who were suspected criminals at a traffic stop, so that's troubling. There's also individuals at lower levels such as Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. He was elected to the Chamber of Deputies some 4 years ago, I believe, ironically by the Progressive Party there. He has quite a social media following, as some other individuals in government do who hold these beliefs, and is known to hold far-right beliefs as running for presidential elections this year. So all of these cases, there are themes to be seen that we can discuss later. I don't want to go through individually, but again, looking at the ideas of hyper-nationalism, militarism, absolute power, and the rejection of diversity, there's clear ties to the present day. However, you couldn't call the majority of these actors themselves fascist government from a political perspective. So with that, I kind of wanted to not necessarily make a call to action, but just say if we were looking for warning signs of these themes, there are some kind of central pillars to that. Anyone who's suppressing freedom and diversity, seeking to centralize power in the executive, subsuming other state functions like the legislature and making them the job of a small group or an individual. That's troublesome. And militant nationalism, not to say that nationalism or your pride in one's country are inherently fascist, but the structural, symbolic, or physical violence against those who don't share those beliefs or who don't fit into that idea of a nation is very much so core to fascist ideology, or the mobilization of that national sentiment to militant ends in any other context. But again, it's an important thing to note that while radical right populist groups and political leaders around the globe engage in these processes, it's more effective to criticize the processes themselves than criticize those individuals or label them directly as fascists, in my opinion. There's also one last dynamic I think we should discuss here, is that the idea of grassroots radicalization, that these processes become accelerated, become worse when the rhetoric or actions of a leader inform his base to then go out and commit radical acts themselves, and then that leader defends those actions. It creates a feedback loop that draws out even more radical sentiment. So these processes are themselves accelerating in practice, I would posit. The main takeaway here is that I believe reducing the term fascist to pejorative simply makes it imprecise and rhetorically ineffective in political criticism, and we can talk about whether it's useful as a definition in academic discussion as well. I think that's a separate issue, but specifically with the idea of political criticism, I feel that's an important idea to come to mind. Some closing thoughts here. Orwell actually made note of this in 1944, so this is, like I said earlier, it's a perennial issue. It does come up again and again that fascist is not necessarily a definite term. Oftentimes it's more of an insult. He says, quote, "The people who recklessly fling the word fascist in every direction at any rate, assign at any rate an emotional significance to it. By fascism they mean, roughly speaking, something cruel, unscrupulous, arrogant, anti-liberal, and anti-working class. Except for the relatively small number of fascist sympathizers, any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to the definition of this much abused word has come." So in sum, it's a political ideology in the historical context that doesn't necessarily translate to defined groups in the modern day. And while its facets are certainly not to be defended, it's also important to kind of disaggregate those bits and talk about what they are. So it's, in my opinion, more effective just to say policy or an individual or a group are racist, militant, xenophobic, authoritarian, anti-democratic, or pursue policies that suppress freedom and diversity, centralize power without limitation, or mobilize a state towards militant nationalism. I think those descriptions are far more precise, and I feel that's more sufficient in our political discourse, but we can certainly discuss that at more length to come. And that's all I have for tonight, so thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.